Okay, so I recorded this on Thursday, back when the biggest news was that Trump had announced a plan for Afghanistan. Then Friday hits, and a hurricane starts to kick up in Texas. Trump pardons Sheriff Joe Apiro and starts talking about a transgender soldier ban again, and talking about exporting or deporting dreamers, former or current illegal immigrants, however you want to look at it, who had come forward and tried to play by the rules. So my gosh, there's a lot to get to there, but this is not ever going to be a podcast where I'm trying to chase the story the fastest, because this is not CNN or Fox News where I'm going after ratings. This is an attempt to do a deep dive into one topic that's going to help us understand something better. So that's what we're going to do here, and we can catch up to all the other stuff. I just may be a few days behind the news cycle, and I guess, if this is kind of where you're getting your news, so to speak, you will too. But when you get there, you're going to have a much better understanding of an in-depth topic as opposed to just people yelling at each other on cable TV, which is, of course, why this podcast exists. All right, Kyleanne Hunter is a former Marine helicopter combat pilot. Then she went to Washington, D.C. and did legislative stuff, and now she's currently in academia out in Colorado. Really fascinating person that will definitely be back on the podcast again. Just a couple of notes as we get into it. The first one is that this was a time where I had to record the show via an app called Anchor, where you can record a podcast on your cell phone. So the audio quality is not quite as good. However, I was able to wrangle up some new gear. So overall, I think you're going to find the audio quality for the show gets a lot better after this episode. And just one other note, we did mention, we did reference back to our first episode where we talked about the possible transgender soldier ban, and I said I never thought anything was going to happen with it, and, well, now it actually looks like something's going to happen with it, so I guess we'll just call that an error. That's in the 4 days between when we recorded this and when it's coming out. The world just changes that fast, I guess. Hey, just one more reminder that the Red Cross and Samaritan's Purse are fantastic organizations doing work right now in Southeast Texas. Not sure how much I'm going to talk about that topic, that event coming up. I do have an uncle, an aunt, and a cousin down there who have been affected, but so far are not flooded out. If that becomes an episode, it's because I have something to say that is completely different than anything anybody else is saying. So we'll see if that becomes the case. But in the meantime, even kicking in $5 or $10, if that's what you've got available right now. So once again, Samaritan's Purse, Red Cross, they're both fantastic. This is episode number 35 with Kyleanne Hunter, talking about strategy in Afghanistan. My name's Seth Towerherd. Let's be neighbors again.
And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
What's funny is there's two episodes that tie into the one we're the topic we're getting into. The first one is I had sort of questioned, not that I didn't really like it, but I was like, did I jump too quick on the transgender troop thing because it's never been talked about again, and all of a sudden it's being talked about again. So
right.
I guess that reaffirms my decision to do it. I still am convinced that what will happen will be absolutely nothing. Either the Trump administration will move on or there'll be a court battle. But that's just the way I think there will be.
I don't think things are going to, especially I think right now, given the fact that, and this ties into even what we were going to talk about here, given the fact that we've just committed more military troops into Afghanistan. And so we need troops, and it's not, and when you commit to a military action like this, you can't just pull 18 to 25-year-olds off the street and send them to fight. We tried that in Vietnam, and it had some pretty disastrous results. And so we need trained, qualified, experienced service members of all types. It doesn't matter like what your race, gender, religion is. We need sexual identity, gender identity. We need, it's even more important in counterinsurgencies like we're trying to do here, to have well-trained, experienced troops. And I cannot foresee the Department of Defense agreeing to want to kick out anyone who's qualified and hasn't actually violated, UCMJ issues. But, this seems like something that's going to get a lot of pushback just because, the department knows, like, we need qualified people. We need experienced people. And why do we want to kick them out?
And from what I understand, the Trump, we don't want to do a whole other episode on this, but the Trump, to recap, and it's worth going back and listening to that one, but the Trump administration apparently didn't give a lot of notice on this, or really any notice. So the actual, higher ups in I guess, management, leadership, whatever you want to say, within the military seem to be fairly caught off guard by that. The other fascinating thing that I'm not a person that needs to be, like, I'm not offended, okay? But I just thought it was interesting that, I talked about I have an extra rib and I'm allergic to nuts. Both of those are an automatic disqualification. And we kind of talked about, should the military become like the average soldier, like a military of averages. So like everybody's, 5'8" to 5'10" because it's easier that way. I was just thinking, like, at 6'6", if you even look at the size of a person in America a century ago because of increased nutrition, everybody's bigger. So if you threw me in like ancient Greece, or in feudal Japan or in medieval Europe, like everybody would want me to fight for them.
You'd be like that giant on Game of Thrones that goes and like rips the doors off of things.
I'm not genuinely offended. I just think it's like, well, that's a strange new world.
Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of awesome.
It's
now I'm getting this visual of like.
I'm going to stop this there because I don't want to, for somebody that might watch the show in the future, I don't want to mess anything up for them because it's such a wonderful experience. I don't want to ruin any plot points. But the other piece of background getting into this is I had a libertarian podcaster on as I try to get a lot of different kinds of, perspectives. And he and I had a pretty lengthy discussion at the time. I recorded it 2 weeks ago, and then we took a break to do 2 solo shows for the Charlottesville stuff. But at the time, I was like, dang, did I spend way too much time on 80s foreign policy that nobody's going to talk about? And all of a sudden it became relevant again because what I had to say was that, that it was right and good and true for the United States to back Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And there certainly were deaths in that war, but the deaths compared to what the Soviet Union did to Ukraine or Poland were so much smaller. And I believe it's one of the greatest military victories in the history of the world that a bunch of literal, mountain men and goat herders drove out the second biggest military on planet Earth at the time. Of course, those weapons were used against us. But how could we have known that 35 years before? I don't think it's wrong to help someone defend from an invading army that's literally going to come in and rape, burn, kill, and steal. Right. No, I completely agree. And I was going to say, like, you mentioned, like, Soviet Union being the second biggest army, and it may be true the second biggest army, but I would say at the time, the most aggressive army, most offensively aggressive army, that their tactics, I think, made them appear bigger than they actually were size-wise, just because what they were actually willing to do tactically made them more of a threat. So let's get into, I want to talk about the troop surge and what Trump is proposing, because I think a lot of people were caught off guard. They're like, wait, we're still there? I didn't know that was really, I don't know. I think we're kind of starting there with the average American. I would like to get into a little bit of India-Pakistan foreign policy, which is something I've talked about in previous episodes, because all of a sudden that's very relevant again. And actually our allegiances seem to be shifting towards India and away from Pakistan, which is a historic shift for the position of the United States. But first of all, if you could just kind of recap your service and legal experiences, and so sort of what is your career like in relation to Afghanistan?
To Afghanistan, so my personal career relationship to Afghanistan in country has been as a Marine in a few different capacities, as a combatant, Cobra pilot, also as the Marine Corps' legislative liaison officer to the House of Representatives. One of our jobs was to assist with the oversight missions. So when members of the House Armed Services Committee or the Appropriations Committee went over to do their oversight missions to Afghanistan, to make sure the troops were actually doing what they were supposed to be doing. I did all the escort and the planning and liaising between members of Congress and military officials to set up those meetings for members to do their oversight. And then I also worked as the military liaison with the House Democracy Partnership, which is a bipartisan group that does peer-to-peer legislative training. So they were founded at the end of the Soviet Union when they saw that you couldn't really do this thing of like just plop democracy down on a country and expect that people who are elected knew what to do. And so they work with, it's a group of members of Congress who actually go and work with elected officials in newly emerging democracies on everything from, teaching them that, no, you actually have to talk to your constituents, which I think some of our members of Congress need to learn right now too, but you have to keep records transparency and setting up libraries of Congress, and they do it, like staff does a lot of work with how to support members, and they bring a military officer with them quite a bit because frequently the military is a big part of the democratic transitions that happen. So I've been there in that capacity as a Marine. I've also been over there with an NGO called Mountain to Mountain, which does a lot of women's empowerment work and in setting up schools and jobs and actually teaching women how to ride bikes, which is a big deal for independence and economic empowerment as well.
Which
that can be a whole different, exactly.
Because you haven't been to the third world, you don't know that somebody actually can strap a live pig to a bike.
Yes,
bike it somewhere
exactly. Oh yeah. And in a lot of places, because of the roads, and Afghanistan's a perfect case of this because starting back in World War II, roads have been mined, landmines put in roads for pressure plates for vehicles all the time. So it's actually usually safer to ride a bike because it's not going to set off a lot of these pressure plates that are designed for tanks.
Yeah, a couple thousand
and
pounds
heavier vehicles. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I've been there in that capacity. I'm also actually am re-engaging with Afghanistan quite a bit on a personal level. As I got a fellowship to be a part of the Women Peacemakers program through the Kroc School of International Peace and Justice at University of San Diego. And so I'm going to be working with a woman who is actively engaged in trying to broker peace between some of the Afghan formal security forces and the militias out there, and working with her to actually document her story and put it in the larger context of what we know about, brokering peace between formal militaries and rebel groups. So that is my Afghanistan experience.
Okay.
Coincidentally as well, the House Democracy Partnership also worked in Pakistan quite a bit. So there's some interesting compare and contrast there with what we have done in Pakistan on that side, like on the more kind of bolstering the legislative side.
Okay. Man, I mean, each one of these could probably be a full episode, and I love that you're willing to be kind of a semi-regular guest here. I think we're going to have to survey a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
Let's start with kind of two views on Afghanistan. One is, my gosh, we did pull out of Iraq, really quickly and said what day we were going to leave, which just motivated people who wanted to take the country for their own interest, and ISIS came out of that, right?
Yep.
The other thing is you can kind of go the classic thought route, which is Dante, not the Inferno, sorry, Machiavelli's The Prince. He said, when you invade something, you can kill everybody, you can stay forever, or you can lose. So, killing everybody, we don't literally have to kill everybody, but, we could say that
kill a lot of people.
Kill a lot of people. That works with the Native American tribes, for sure. And then as far as losing, we can look at Vietnam, or you can stay forever. We're in every country we've ever fought in, pretty much. I mean, I actually, and you might disagree with this, to me, it does seem like a lot of money is spent in Germany, and we have a lot of troops there when it is, one of our two greatest allies in the world, and it seems very, very stable. It seems like that is a very expensive military cost compared to where that that money could be spent for safety.
It is, and I think that's a larger question of like, are we in clearly we were in Germany initially for kind of nation rebuilding post World War II, but I think you can make the argument that we're in Germany more now because of its physical location. It does put us closer in, and Germany was a crucial point for both Iraq and Afghanistan injuries of having a very large military medical apparatus in Germany to be able to medevac people there. I think we saved lots of lives.
So it's not really a military strategic place. It's like an airport, basically.
Right. And I think we can make, and a topic of another great show in here, making the argument is, do we need actual U.S. assets there, or is our alliance strong enough that we can fully rely on German assets, which, they're a very developed country. Nobody worries about getting sick in Germany. Their hospitals are just fine, probably better than some of ours. But so I think that's very correct, and it's very interesting, and it leads to, I think if we're talking about Afghanistan again, one of the issues that I would say I most agree with the president in their speech about is that if we are going to win, if that's even a thing, if that's even possible, any sort of troop withdrawal has to be done on a conditions-based rather than a timeline-based approach. As we saw in Iraq, as you said, when we said we were going to leave by a certain date, we left by a certain date, and there's a power vacuum there. And that's something that's almost inevitable if you invade and leave. And I think Machiavelli is absolutely right on those points. The problem I think that we're running into with this is that we have no clear definition of what winning is. And I think it's a little even scarier now, where if you listen to Trump's speech on Monday, he point blank said, we're here to kill terrorists, not nation build. And that creates, I think, a slippery slope situation where winning looks like killing terrorists. And it opens the door for a situation where body count becomes victory.
Yeah. And we get into I don't know how much we're droning people now. I found that to be one of the most concerning moments in American history.
Yes.
It's not that I didn't think it should have happened. But there was a guy an American citizen that defected to the Taliban and went over there, and I think it was actually a white guy, became radicalized through the propaganda. And I'm saying not from a traditionally Arab or Muslim family, right? Just this became his cause in life, and they found him, and Obama droned him. And it's not even that I necessarily disagree with. I mean, he probably should have droned him, right? But all of a sudden, we had a U.S. president pick out a guy in another country and kill him with a robot. And if you don't think that's precedent setting, you got another thing coming.
It's a very concerning precedent possibility thing that has the potential to happen to do that. And that's something that I think but it also opens up this slippery slope again when we say, what does winning look like? In some ways, you can define the fact that we have the power to find somebody and kill them from the sky with a robot, and a dude sitting in Nevada who's doing it.
Yeah.
Is that not winning? I mean, okay, you have that sort of power, but I think that there's something fun when we talk about military strategy. It's very important to remember that strategy is military action defined to political goals and political outcomes. Otherwise, you just have military action, which is violence enacted by the state. And if it's not tied to actual political goals, is it really a strategy, or is it just action? And I think that what we heard on Monday was a talk about military action, but there's no clear end game, and it creates the issue of we're here forever because we don't have a actual end game. What does it mean to win? What does it mean to live or to leave? What are these conditions under which we're saying it's okay to withdraw? And I fear personally that we're going to turn into another Vietnam situation where everybody you killed just became Viet Cong, and you figured out a way to make them Viet Cong. And so now does it come up to an issue that where the explicit mandate is to say that we're there to kill terrorists, does that mean we just keep killing? And so everybody we kill becomes a terrorist.
Yeah. No, and I totally see that. And it's interesting that you're, you have a foot over the line on each side as far as the speech on Monday. From your eyes, you flew combat missions there, and you've done diplomatic work. Like, what is a winning point? Like, where is the end game? What would you like to see happen, and how could we get there?
Yeah. Well, if I could answer that, I could probably win the Nobel Peace Prize too. But I would say, in an ideal world, if we could wave a magic wand, if we were here with Kai's Magic Wand Land, and then I'll pull it back into, I think, a little more realistic realism. Winning would look like Afghanistan being a self-deterministic state with a stable government that has control over the use of force and the use of violence. And that sounds very academic-y, but I say that because when in kind of more of the parlance of political science, when we talk about really what a state is or a country is, it's an entity that has a legitimate government that has a monopoly over the use of political violence. So basically it means that you have a system of government that can both control the laws and also control violence, and it only uses violence for legitimate reasons. That's clearly not the case right now in Afghanistan, because you have the Taliban who's out there enacting violence kind of wherever they want, again, and the government doesn't have any control to really rein in the laws around this. So if we were to pull it back to a little more realistic area or realistic goal, I think that we need to both look at, what is Afghanistan, and this is something that goes back, I think, much more to the time I spent there with the House Democracy Partnership, is that you have Kabul as a city, and they have a great deal of control around Kabul and that area, and then you have some other areas like Bimiyan and some of the more northern provinces that do respect the central Afghan authority and government, and then you have areas out in the further provinces that they have no idea that Kabul even exists. They don't. If foreign troops weren't there showing up and telling them that they were there, they'd be like, what is Kabul? We've never left our village. And so I think we need to take a little different approach than we do in the case of, say, Germany, that was a legitimate nation state prior to World War II, and have a real hard look and ask and say, is Afghanistan as a country defined by these borders on the map really the right answer? Or is it more of a hybrid solution of something even similar to Pakistan, where you have a state, but then you also have these federally administrated tribal areas that aren't quite part of the same state? Is Afghanistan ever going to be this one big unified country, or should we focus on quote unquote nation building in and around the areas where the government can legitimately exert control, geographically, and then work on empowering more of the local villages to empower themselves as local entities and work more with these village stability operations, and not think of them so much as part of Afghanistan, but as these kind of more individualistic, independent little micro villages, because they don't care. They don't necessarily care if they're Afghan or not, so. Well,
yeah, and if I could jump in there to reinforce that a bit, we already kind of have that in the United States with tribal reservations, to where they have their own court systems and that type of thing. And this is something that, Woodrow Wilson is certainly not one of my favorite people. He was in the KKK. I'm not a huge fan, but he would have reshaped the world had people listen to him after World War One, and they did, and so they got World War II without reason, right? Just about. I mean, Winston Churchill had some great ideas as well, these kind of outcasts. But France states breaking Iraq and breaking the Middle East. France and Britain broke the Middle East because they forced people into countries because they had to give nations to people who attacked Turkey. Jordan became a nation, and then one of the other provinces became a nation. Their own country, and what happened was, you have those Muslims who actually got along and make them be a country together. Yazidis, and there are other factions as well. And you got the same thing in the Congo, which has been in pretty much a civil war for about 35 years. Well, there are 8 tribes that make up the Congo. What we need to do is somebody needs to go in and just let them be tribes. And I would argue the same thing. I think that Kurdistan needs to exist, and the Kurds need to have their own country. Because they're never going to get along with the Sunnis and the Shias, and we actually need to let these people, we think, tribalism, democracy can fix everything, and it's like we need to let these people be what they want to be.
Well, and it's this idea of, the nation state being the be-all, end-all political system, and I think that when we force that idea, saying that, well, that's winning, we're never going to win, because that's never actually going to be. It's not going to happen. There has never been. I think if you go back to the history, you go back to Rommel or Genghis Khan, nobody is militarily successful in that area of the world. In Afghanistan, in what we call today Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, it defeated Alexander the Great and the USSR and a lot of people in between.
Yes, I mean, they brought Rommel brought elephants and couldn't do anything there. So you get the it is not an area where military adventurism is going to be successful, and so I think we need to fundamentally reshape what does it mean to quote unquote win. What is that? And so I mean, I would advocate, if I had in charge my perfect world, is to reframe our thinking and accept that tribalism is a perfectly acceptable solution, especially because it's likely going to bring more stability. If you allow these villages to either stay a microcosm and stay isolated and not want to interact with the rest of the world, or to interact in the way in which they want to, whether it's through trade or through some sort of mutual kind of protection agreements, then that's important. And something else I think that we need to recognize is that I was very worried on Monday when I heard things, because it brings any possibility of having any sort of ceasefire or peace negotiations with the Taliban off the table. Yes, we have this, I think, hard line where we say we don't negotiate with terrorists. However, the Taliban, I firmly believe, fits in this sort of nebulous area where they are a very well-structured hierarchical organization that has imposed order and actually benefits in some areas. We can disagree with how they did it. I mean, most of it's through the opium trade and the poppy trade, but they have.
Okay, so they have brought some financial stability, is what you were saying on the Taliban.
Right.
To give the counterpoint, they also throw gay people off buildings, right?
They do horrible things, and I don't think that they should be the power source. But I also honestly believe that if us, and this I think gets to one of my further points around some of the problems I have with how we're going about this, that if we can negotiate/broker ceasefires in a way that does not cost any more American or Afghan lives, that's good. Like that is a net gain. If we can get people to stop killing each other, that's a net positive. And part of that, I don't see a way that we can kill enough Taliban to get them, to quote unquote win. And I think your Native American analogy at the beginning is very important to this. So yes, when us as Europeans came in and invaded North America, we essentially wiped out the Native American population. One of the reasons that was able to happen was that, Native Americans were a people, a ethnic group, not necessarily a ideology. And it's not like they were out recruiting people to join them. I would probably argue that if that were the case, that, the American, the way in which we went about killing Native Americans would have provided quite a good propaganda tool to recruit people to become Native Americans and fight Americans to their cause. Because you could paint this picture of the big bad white man and recruit people to your side.
And especially because, sorry,
go
I
ahead.
can jump in there real quick.
Yes, definitely.
Actually, what you're seeing with the white power movement right now is the same thing. Like, fantastic article in Washington Post this week about who a lot of these people are. There are very few what I would call true blue blood believers in the white power thing. A lot of these guys were bullied as kids, and finally somebody told them they were tough and made them feel tough. There's a lot of like Asperger's syndrome where these people have a very hard time making friends, and they don't make friends anywhere else. And the white power movement says, come on in. You get the same thing with economics. Like I've been thinking about with the youth jobless rate in Palestine, like what if we just put some freaking money in there so we didn't have to fight them later? Like,
right.
Like a startup, like a tech startup hub there could save us billions of dollars in military costs because it gives something to do other than sit around and get mad enough to be a terrorist.
Exactly, and I think that's where we end up with problems. Like, yes, they are horrible people, and they throw gay people off buildings, and they incredibly oppress women, and those things are awful, and they should not, rule. However, if we go in and wholesale just say, like, we're just going to go kill terrorists, and we say you're a terrorist, so we're going to kill you, it does embolden their cause, is that, the U.S., unfortunately, and it's one of our military realities, has a history of making large military missteps, killing a lot of civilians, and then going back and saying, like, oh, but they were actually X, whether it's Viet Cong or Al-Qaeda or Taliban. And with the advent of social media and everybody's a reporter, these things are becoming more and more visible when we make these mistakes. And I think that the fear of saying we're just there to kill terrorists is going to give them so much more fuel to say, look how bad the U.S. is. Like, if they come here, they're going to kill you. Right. And it's going to just create a continual perpetual cycle. And one of the larger overall problems, which could probably be like the whole subject of another episode here, is that it's very easy for us to continue to do this. And I think in particular, this really plays to the current president's base's beliefs. And there's no real U.S. buy-in to continuing to stay involved militarily. We can look at the numbers and say, like, yes, less than 0.5% of the population is currently on active duty. The number of families that, I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but I think it's around like 70% of new recruits who join the military have a family member who has been in the military. So the physical toll that this is going to take is concentrated in less and less of the population. The financial toll, being at war now for 16 years, and we haven't seen any real war tax that has been enacted. In a democracy, one of the most powerful tools to constrain the use of the military is the electorate, electing people in that aren't going to vote for it. And I think that the all-volunteer force is good for a lot of reasons, and I think the use of just drafting everybody and sending them over isn't the answer either. But without any real buy-in from the American people, we can talk about military strength and military power and military adventurism and really play to this whole idea that the use of the military makes us strong, without them ever having to feel like bear any of the consequences for it. And it's that whole, like, I find it very amusing personally as a veteran that people think that somehow supporting the troops means we're going to go send them to fight more wars. I'm like, well, no, it should be sort of the opposite. Like, if you actually want to support the troops, like, how about you don't send them off to go get killed? And but it's allowing us to play to this idea that, the president campaigned quite a bit on how he was going to make the biggest military, the strongest military, nobody would want to mess with us. And it almost feels like this is a way he gets to use it now and say, look how big and strong our military is, and we're going to unleash it on Afghanistan. Probably because he was a little reined in from fire and fury on North Korea that would have been much more devastating to much more people.
Which I never bought into anything was going to happen because we weren't moving our troops out of South Korea, and we have a lot of Americans down there. And an ally that, they could suffer millions of casualties. Just because of time, we got to kind of wind this thing down. And obviously, as long as you're good with it, we're going to do this again. But I want to talk a little bit about the bigger region. Pakistan, and immediately adjacent to Afghanistan, really started as kind of, I would say, an American or Greek classical type country, to where big on religious freedom and autonomy and things that I would call Western values. Most people call Western values. They're not there now, but we have been traditionally aligned with Pakistan. When we have it aligned with Pakistan, it hasn't gone great. India has a big troop buildup on this glacier that I'm not sure why India wants. And when, because of
Britain fought a war over the Falkland Islands too, and nobody's quite sure why they wanted those.
Yeah. So somebody else can't have it. But,
basically.
Pakistan certainly has, got ties to the Taliban and ties to terror and that type of thing. However, one of the grave missteps of Bill Clinton was he thought that he was bringing more peace by having them dismantle their Air Force. Mm-hmm. And what instead happened was they went out and just bought a nuke on the black market, most likely sold off by Russian soldiers who needed money for, like, groceries. At the fall of the USSR, they sold, at least one theory is these Russian soldiers sold uranium to the Yakuza just because they needed money to eat. The Yakuza sold it to Pakistan. I think that if there is a nuclear warhead used, in our lifetimes, I actually think it'll be India and Pakistan are the ones that are shooting. And we don't think about that because we didn't have an American narrative of global events. And we don't have a ton to do with that. We have shifted our allegiances to India, and we've got a stronger allegiance with India. And I'm not sure I'm super against that, but it is a big move compared to where the past two presidents have been. Can you talk about how that could affect, our influence in the region or what that means in the region?
Yeah. I think that and this is what I'll say, another thing, like at least in theory, that I think was good coming out of the speech is a mention of Pakistan, a nod to Pakistan, a fact that Pakistan needs to be involved with this. I don't think going about and being hostile to them is necessarily the way to do it because of exactly the history that you mentioned. That there has been a history of our own shifted allegiances, of economic issues, of military issues, all of that. So I don't think.
Well, if you wanted to boil it down to your neighborhood, like to boil down Pakistan, India to your neighborhood, and this is a little overly simplistic, but with them getting a nuke, it's sort of like if somebody bought the house next door to yours and he was in Hell's Angels, and the Hell's Angels guys throw huge drunken and drug-fueled parties on the weekends, and sometimes they stand right at the grass line that divides your properties, and they stand there with boards with nails through them. And eventually you go out and buy a gun because you're scared. What else is somebody going to expect you to do? That's pretty much what happens at the nation level. And Pakistan is a very different country than when it was founded. But if we're really looking for for peace and not war, if we're India's ally, then we need to tell India to pull some troops back because they position troops as if they're always ready to invade Pakistan at any moment, and that does not help with peace.
No, that doesn't help with much of anything. It doesn't help with peace. It doesn't help with economic relationships. It doesn't help with trying to have educational exchanges. But I think so. I think we need to engage both of them more, and I think we need to engage them both independently as well as sort of as a neighborhood village. I think that this is where I fear that like our state and diplomatic and developmental mechanisms are getting so underfunded and understaffed. I think even more than underfunded. We still don't have ambassadors. We don't have full diplomatic staff over there, because personally, when we go back to what does winning look like, our diplomatic efforts in Pakistan and India are far more important to overall overwhelming peace and stability, I think, in the region and in Afghanistan, than having a strong diplomatic mission even in Afghanistan right now. And I say that because, again, like the neighborhood, the neighborhood effect, that if you can, if you go back to your example with the, Hell's Angels, if you can convince, the guy who's living across the street from you, who is like a biker gang dude and is also super like, looks like a Hell's Angel more or less, but also like wants some peace and quiet and to go to bed at midnight every night. Like, if you can embolden him and build up him and have him throw like, parties that are going to attract people to come over to stop, being thugs and putting nails up, and you'll probably not have to use your gun. And maybe that was a bad analogy, but what I was getting at, that you have a, both culturally, religiously, and just proximity-wise, more, sort of like groups, people understand the history better because they've lived through it. They understand some of the particulars of the region around the geography, the history with the Soviet Union. They lived through all of this, the history of imperialism, that these countries lived through that we didn't. That they are much more powerful allies and powerful examples of nation building than necessarily even doing direct nation building in Afghanistan is. To sort of parallel this, I think one of the worst things that we did was, in the days after 9/11, Iran came and shared intelligence with us, and it's like we've been trying, because they again have a very strong vested interest in Afghanistan being stable, sharing a border on that side, which is another, the other side. But they clearly don't want instability and violence and the Taliban harboring there. And I think we should have leveraged Iran much more. I mean, yes, there are issues with the Iranian government as well, but if you can find these commonalities of saying, hey, we've got the same interests here. We want a stable Afghanistan. And we need to bring in the neighboring groups more in a way that is saying, hey, let's, we all have the same interest. Let's not bully them into getting on board and helping, but what is your interest in Afghanistan? What does it mean for you to have a winning state?
And Iran is legit. I mean, Iran has truly elite troops that look like literal stormtroopers from Star Wars. It's creepy. They look like KKK stormtroopers, which is maybe a little bit of a bad branding move. Apparently, they don't watch enough Western movies to get that. Which, by the way, Iran actually has a pretty good. The funny thing about Iran, as far as like Americanized culture, they have a lot of country music, like Iranian country music, and they have a lot of movies, which is which is funny, and maybe makes us a little I don't know, maybe makes us a little more able to relate to them. Unfortunately, I got to wrap this. There's so much good stuff here. As long as you're good with being back on and you're not off diplomating somewhere and around the world where you can't get to.
I am always welcome, or always anxious to come back on. I would love to, as I had mentioned at the beginning here, I'm doing this fellowship around women peace builders, and when I'm out there, I would love to kind of maybe even re-engage this topic, because I don't think it's going to be going away, and bring in some of her perspective.
That would be fantastic.
If you'd be interested.
And I'll link to your Twitter and everything for people to find you. And we'll catch you next time,
yes,
okay?
Please do. All right, sounds great. You have a great rest of your day.